Welcome, everyone. We'll start in a couple of minutes as people enter the webinar. Welcome. If you're just joining, we'll get started in just a minute or two. Well, welcome everyone to the Harris School of Public Policy's Perspective Series. This is our inaugural Perspective event, and I can think of no one better to have here than Dr. Janice Jackson. This series is our real opportunity to focus on issues of diversity and inclusion, which are crucial to making good public policy. And the Harris School and the University of Chicago are committed to fostering discourse that brings in lots of different perspectives, lots of different lived experiences, as many voices as we can to address the really challenging policy issues that are in front of us today. And this Perspective series is going to be a hallmark way for us to do that over the course of the year. And this particular year, we're going to focus on education, which is of vital importance in giving opportunities across our city and across the globe. And we're seeing so many challenges, especially this year, with access to education for students in different parts of our city, given the COVID pandemic. And that's why it's particularly exciting to have Dr. Jackson here, who has dedicated her career to really launching opportunities for Chicago's public school students and dedicating herself to equity, diversity, and inclusion in opportunities, in resources, in access. So I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation, hitting on Dr. Jackson's core priorities and how much she's been able to accomplish at Chicago Public Schools. But I'm not introducing Dr. Jackson. Michelle Horace is going to give you much more detail on her background, which I think is going to be inspiring and impressive for all of you. So I have the pleasure of just telling you a sentence or two about Michelle, who many of you have already interacted with. Michelle is our first Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Harris School and has been instrumental in launching our roadmap and has already launched so much innovative programming. We're so lucky to have Michelle as a partner and a leader for the Harris School. She brings more than 20 years of experience in urban policy and development. She's worked for nonprofits, she's worked for governments. She has a breadth of experience that spans a lot of sectors, and you can see that in the depth of programming that she has already launched at Harris in her time here. So I know you'll all really enjoy the conversation between Michelle Horace and Janice Jackson, and I will now turn it over to Michelle to introduce our guest. You're on mute, Michelle.
That would help, right? Thank you, Dean Baker, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And I have to say that I'm very excited to kick off our inaugural speaker series event called Perspectives, which is an initiative created by the Harris Office of Diversity and Inclusion. There are 3 events in the series this year, and all will focus on this theme around race and equity in education specifically. And tonight I am honored to engage in a conversation with Dr. Janice Jackson, the CEO of Chicago Public School Systems. And we are going to engage in an in-depth conversation on how CPS is advancing principles of equity and inclusivity in the curriculum and the culture in the country's 3rd largest school district that exists. So I do want to spend a few seconds, because you do have an amazing resume, Dr. Jackson, and as a former student and teacher and principal and network chief and chief education officer, and now the chief executive officer You have been immersed in Chicago public school systems your entire life. And as I mentioned before, you are the CEO of the third largest school district in the country, and you're responsible for setting our district's collective goals, ensuring the children of Chicago develop into the thinkers, leaders, and innovators of the future. Dr. Jackson is focused on providing students in every neighborhood in the city with equitable access to high quality programming and facilities, and she's committed to developing a pre-K through 14 continuum that is steeped in academic rigor, supports the well-rounded development of the whole child, and provides students with multiple pathways to success. So without further ado, I want to welcome you to our virtual stage, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. And I so wish that we could be together all in the same space at the Keller Center right now, but this just gives us something to look forward to when we do this again next year.
Yeah.
So there are several items tonight that I would love to get your perspective on, but I also want to make sure that I carve out a little bit of time for Q&A. We have a lot of people who have registered for this webinar, so I'm excited about that. And so because of that, it might be a little difficult to do open it up for Q&A, but many participants did send their questions ahead of time, so I'm going to make sure to carve out some time for that.
Sure.
Oh, I think a good place to start is a focus on where we are in this current moment in time, in the middle of a pandemic. There were lots of questions actually that came in from participants that centered on sort of how are we handling the pandemic? What impact is the pandemic having on our children? And more importantly, how is CPS, or what is CPS doing to ensure that all children, especially our Black and Brown children, our ELL students, our students with disabilities, our low-income students, who have parents who might be essential workers, what is CPS doing right now to make sure that all of our students are fully supported through this remote learning?
Yeah. Well, that's the question that's top of mind for everybody. And I don't think I have to spend a lot of time, conveying to the group how challenging this is for everybody. I do think that we know a lot more, 7 or 8 months later about COVID-19 and how to respond to a pandemic. But like so many institutions throughout the country, we were, surprised and had to really pivot quickly in order to provide high quality education to our students, which is our primary focus and mission and vision of CPS. So let me just take a step back because when I look at this, it's like I'm writing the story in the book in my head. And early on in this pandemic, I think our response was, swift and focused on the things that Chicago Public Schools or any school system is most uniquely positioned to do, which is to be responsive to the educational as well as the social needs of the students and families that we serve. And so right away, our focus was on a few things. Number one, how will we educate students in this new environment, which I'm going to come back to and spend most of my time on because your question was related to remote learning. The second piece was really our understanding, which I think more people fully appreciate now, which is that schools provide much more than an education. We provide a lot of social services, a lot of biological needs are met in the school. And so making sure that we continue to, provide a place that was safe for our children, to feed families. We've served, over 30 million meals and counting, probably more than that. When CPS is operationalized, we are the largest restaurant in the state of Illinois. We always say that we serve more meals every single day than any other place in the state. And so kids rely on us for a lot of things. Of course, in order to access learning remotely, we had to address the digital divide. And that was a two-part focus. First, the devices, which I think we responded to swiftly, but the internet, and not just the internet, access to high-speed internet, because what we learned is a lot of our families have figured out how to access the internet in a variety of ways. They're tethered to phones and other devices, but high-speed broadband internet is a challenge. And I'm happy to say that one of the things that was born out of this pandemic is innovation in the Chicago Connected program, where we have now committed to providing free high-speed internet for the next 4 years for 1,000 of our students and families is an amazing initiative. And this is one of those things that had you asked me, prior to COVID, I would say that's going to take us 2 years to do. We need to do X, Y, and Z. But because of this need and because of the crises, we were able to find inspiration and opportunity. And so I see a positive coming out of this. And that's just my personal leadership style. I always try to find a positive, especially in a situation like this, where I even think the strongest amongst us have really struggled. With regard to remote learning, I should preface this by saying I am somewhat of a traditionalist and a classical person when it comes to education. I believe students should be in the classroom in front of a highly qualified teacher, getting access to the curriculum, and network and guidance with the qualified professional every single day is the best approach. Excuse me. There's no question. Sorry, that went down the wrong pipe. Sorry about that. There's no question, though. I can't believe this is happening.
That's okay.
Just got something down the wrong pipe. But anyway, there's no question that remote learning has been challenging. But with that said, I think that our teachers, our students, our families, our parents have really stepped up in order to provide support for our kids, but we need them back in our schools. And so that has been a challenge, throughout the country. We've seen a variety of schools go back and close. And I know some of those questions may come up later, but for us, the focus has been, how do we get kids back in school so that we can provide them with a high quality education? Because some of the early data that we're seeing is that some of the same disparities with regard to access, engagement, attendance that played out in the traditional school setting, we see that playing out in a remote setting. And for me, somebody who's tried to address the inequities in our system and really dismantle them, that's really kind of heartbreaking to see, because we are in fact creating a brand new system. And who wants to create a brand new system that is plagued with some of the same problems and disparities that we see in the traditional system? So if I had to characterize what the biggest challenge is, it really is creating a new system and a new way of educating kids, but not reproducing or repeating kind of the sins of the past.
So you said two things that I'm going to circle back later on and ask you. One was about technology, and then the other one is you talked about sort of all of the other players that are a part of this equation that's helping and making this situation work. I'm going to come back to that because there were a lot of questions from participants about how can we help, how can we be on the other side of the equation and be more solutions focused. So I'm going to circle back on that. Another question related to the pandemic though. So there are lots of lessons that you are learning in real time. And like all school districts, right, when this happened on March 13th, right, it was this reactive response, and you had to do what you can, and then people had the summer to sort of think about if we were going to stay remote in the fall, how can we do this better? Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know if has this situation, has the pandemic revealed something to you that you didn't already know existed in the district?
You know what? I don't think it revealed anything that I didn't know. I think a few things. I think the pandemic has definitely laid bare some of the things that have challenged me as an African-American person my entire life. And I think that coupled with the murder of George Floyd and the things that happened as a result of that, I think it's a positive thing in that people are much more aware. I think the pandemic, people are at home, they're watching the news more, they're more tuned in to social media and paying attention to what's going on. And so I think that, when history reports out on this period of time, I think some of those things will be brought into the conversation. I think that it has laid bare some of the ugly truths that exist in our country and in our nation, and in this case, in our school system. You know, we've been talking about disparities. We've been talking about the fact that the playing field isn't level. We've been talking about the competing demands that many of our parents in low income communities have compared to their, you know, parents who are in more affluent communities. But I think this has made it more clear. And because everybody had to stop and pause, people are much more reflective about what does it mean? What does it mean to be a person who, you know, works in a grocery store, where many of our parents do, who have children, multiple children at different grade levels, who have to educate them now in this setting while still providing for their family to keep their job because they are essential workers. And so I think that people are much more sensitive and have a better understanding and a stronger, a more broad, I should say, point of view. So I think that that has happened. I think for us, one of the positive things is that we're stronger than we believe we are. I think as a school system, there are a couple of things that stand out as positive, although there are many challenges. Number one, the remote learning program that we were able to stand up is really good and exceptional. I think our teaching and learning team in a very short period of time put together a program and a framework that, once again, had you asked me prior to this, I would have said we need 2 or 3 years to pull this off and get all the components together. And they did that, you know, in a matter of weeks and then months to refine it. I think our teachers really rose to the occasion. I think the first time where I really was struck by the creativity of our educators was with the end of the year celebrations and how hard people work to give people, you know, our kids an acknowledgement for their accomplishments and some sense of normalcy, while also doing that given the, you know, dangerous environment that we were in. And then when we started in the fall, I think our teachers really had a lot of time to prepare for remote learning and to be creative. And while it's not perfect, it's imperfect. And we have serious challenges with access. When you look at the data, the students that we're all mostly concerned about, that we're overly concerned about because of the disparities, are the same students where we're having trouble getting them online, despite, you know, dealing with the device and the internet connectivity issue. There are far more issues that compete for their attention. I think that that is still a challenge, but I've been really, really impressed with our teachers and the creativity of a lot of the educators in the district to make this work. So yeah, but I don't think I'm surprised by anything, but I feel like conversations around equity are more real, less coffee talk and kind of saying the right thing to sound hooked in or woke or connected. I think people are really trying to figure things out. And I think people are more aware of their privilege. And as a result, I hope when we return to normal, whatever that new normal is, people keep the lessons in mind from COVID.
Yeah, I've certainly heard a lot of people talking about, you know, we've always known that there are equity issues, right? Disparities exist. But I think for some people, and certainly some other districts, they didn't realize they existed at this level. And I think some districts, people would say that the pandemic really sort of pulled the wool back in even in higher ed. It's when, especially when education, college in particular, is supposed to be sort of this equal playing field, right? Like this is the equalizer, but then a pandemic hits and you have students who can't get back into the country or students who can't get home, or like all types of things have happened that actually shed light on the true inequities that exist.
Yeah.
I know that in 2019, you unveiled an ambitious 5-year roadmap for Chicago public schools to strengthen the commitments to academic progress, financial stability, and integrity. How has the pandemic impacted your implementation of this roadmap?
Yeah. Well, I think beyond the initial shock of school closings, and if I could be honest, I didn't even know what that looked like. I couldn't even imagine that when we were making that decision. You know, like everything, we're resilient. It occurred. I guess a close second of a fear of mine was like, what was going to happen to the vision? The vision for Chicago public schools is comprehensive. It focuses on and builds on the progress that has been made over the past 10 years, but really sets out a course for us to really meet higher goals. And part of that is really reaching students who have been overlooked in schools that have been overlooked. And so I was really excited about the launch and some of the work that we've been able to do to move towards meeting those goals. So I was absolutely worried about what that would mean for CPS. What I learned from that process is that Chicago Public Schools was even better situated, and we had an advantage because although we were responding to the pandemic and the crisis before us, we kept coming back to the vision. And I think everyone listening to this call, when you think about your respective institutions, the one thing that we all had to do is figure out what is essential. What do we need to continue to do in order to meet the goals of our organization? And what can we stop doing? It's kind of a nice to do, a nice to have, but we have to stop doing it because of the circumstances. And having a strong vision as kind of like that filter has really helped us in the school system, where, as you can imagine, there are always so many things happening. So when I talk to our principals and teachers and try to keep them motivated around this work, I always point back to, like, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? We know that there will be tremendous learning loss, which is something that pains me greatly. We know that, some of the data that has been trending in the right direction is either going to be stagnant or possibly negatively affected because of what's happening with COVID. But we also know that we've set goals, we have strategies related to those goals, and that we have to stay the course. I think the other thing that was powerful in our vision is that we set equity as the centerpiece for the work that we're doing. And so, in practice, which I'll get to later, some of the questions that may come up, we always start with who needs the most from us, who has the biggest disadvantage, who is going to need, more support in order to meet whatever expectation we set. And I think that our school system and our teachers and principals do this on a more regular basis as well. We're more responsive in that way. And so if you look at the vision for CPS, which I'm not sure if you share with the participants, we can probably put it in the chat if that's available later at some point. But one of the things in our vision that I'm proud of is that for all of our goals, we highlight a specific equity goal, and that's at the student achievement level. That's when we're talking about our hiring goals for teachers in the district. And we made those very explicit and called them out intentionally in our vision because we wanted to make sure that everyone in the organization, and I see it's in the chat now, had an opportunity to know what the goals are and that they had a laser-like focus on the equity goals as well.
So I think that's actually a good segue because my next set of questions are specifically about equity. And I know equity is a term that it's not an easy one to define. And because I think there's so much controversy over how you measure it. How do you know that you are being successful? How do you create these goals and create metrics that allow you to see that progress is being made, and how do you define progress? So I am curious to hear your thoughts about this a little bit. So, some people say that there's this movement in education reform that believes that in order to resolve the achievement gap, that historical practices that focus on educational equality, treating students all the same, must be replaced with efforts that advance educational equity, sort of ensuring that students have access to resources that they need to graduate and be prepared for success after high school. What are your thoughts about this sort of equality versus equity issue, and how do your thoughts come out in your vision and in your roadmap?
Yeah, a few things. First, we're not pretending to be the equity experts. I mean, there are people who are learning and talking and writing about this all the time. But I do think that as a school system, we've done a lot of good work that people can learn from. I think we start with a couple of key points and premises that we start from, and then I'll get into the framework. Number one, equity in action. This is a pet peeve of mine, and I saw you struggling with it even when you were talking earlier. It is vogue to talk about equity now. It's overused. People are really inauthentic a lot of times when they talk about it. And people say things that sound good, but when you really start talking about equity in action, many of us, not just white people, Black people, anybody who's benefited from this, inherently racist system that we operate in, gives pause. I can give some examples of that later, but I'll just let that sit there. So number one, when I, hired our first chief equity officer, which was my first official act as the CEO, Maurice Sweeney, who's a former principal of a neighborhood high school in CPS, the first thing I told him is that I did not want coffee talk. I did not want a bunch of workshops and people coming together, listening to great thinkers and speakers say things that make us feel good. And then we go back to the school and we can walk into a classroom and tell if it's an AP classroom because of the color of the skin of the kids that are in the classroom. So let's start with that one. So the second piece was, so first, equity in action. The second piece is that every single adult in our school system, and I'm talking about that context in particular, has power. And because they have power, that means that they make decisions every single day that either advances equity or hinders the progress that we are all collectively as a society trying to achieve. And the reason that was an important point to make is because, again, going back to kind of the inauthentic, less effective conversations or discourse around equity, people only point to the figureheads or the powers that be, or the people that are highest up in the food chain. So in CPS, that looks like the mayor, that looks like the Board of Education, that looks like me. When in fact, all of us, and we definitely understand our privileged decision making. People remind us every single day. Thank you very much. But we also need to make sure people know that teachers make decisions every single day that advance equity. Who you call on, who you recommend for programming. I'm in this seat today because I read on grade level. I was polite. My family raised us a certain way. So I was given every opportunity, every program, every field trip, every ambassadorship. That is equity in action in schools, and helping people to understand that we make decisions every single day. All of us. The mayor does not make all of these decisions, the CEO, the network chief, the principal. And so really making sure people understand that all of us have power, especially if we're in these key roles in the school system, and that it is our job to make decisions that dismantle some of the inequities that we are all championing against. So those are kind of the 2 points. We put together a framework because my education around leadership tells me that you need an ambitious vision and something clear that people can look to, but you also need a common language. And to your point earlier, a lot of people think equity means different things. So I think Equity 101 is making sure people understand equity and equality are 2 different things. But then we also wanted to define what equity means in CPS and how is that operationalized. So if you look at our equity framework, which again, we can share in the chat as well, there are 4 components. So we look at liberatory thinking. How do we think? Because a lot of people say things, but their actions are very different than what they say. And, this is across the board. This isn't attributed to one race or one group. I do think as African Americans, we're a little bit more attuned to this. It's something we pay attention to because it's part of our lived experience. But I think even that we've participated and some of us have benefited from this system. So we have to check our privilege as well. I think the second piece is how resources are allocated. That's only 1/4 of the components. How we interact with our families and the people who are most impacted. And so we started with, what does equity mean in CPS? What does this framework look like? And the 4th component are policies and procedures. And so we started to act on those. So in the policies and procedures place, I'll just give a quick example. We have thousands of policies in CPS. We examined about 130 policies in our district and revise them with an equity lens in mind. And so over the past 2 years, we've been updating them. This requires board action and authorization. And some of them are minor. It's changing words, making sure things are more, modern and politically correct and appropriate. In other places, it is legitimately codifying, we will no longer do X, Y, and Z. Some things are symbolic, some things are really real. And so I think that's one component. With regard to resource allocation, number one, being more transparent about how our resources are allocated. But what we're also engaged in right now is our working group with community stakeholders and revising how we distribute the money. And so some of those revisions were made last year. This was one of the mayor's big initiatives, but it's going to be an even bigger change going into next school year, where we're looking at evidence-based funding the same way the state changed their funding mechanism to evidence-based funding, where it says if a school has students with the following demographics, special education, EL, low income, et cetera, they need additional resources in order to level the playing field. And so those are some of the ways that we are trying to put equity in action, but the framework is the common kind of lens that brings us back to what is it that we're trying to achieve. And there have been some successes, but I also think we've learned a lot. Like I said, it's not as easy as it seems. We're looking at selective enrollment schools and our policies around that. And everybody says, once again, over, in the coffee talk space, we should do this. But then when you start to change it, and that means your kid can't get into this school because this kid is going to get into the school, the conversation is very different. And so we're working through that. We'll stay tuned. But I think that publicly declaring this is what we're all about allows people to hold us accountable to those things as a system.
Can you talk about how is the community and parents engaged in this process? You just mentioned a lot of work that has already been done, and then a lot of work that you have on the horizon. How does the community know what's happening, and how are they engaged? And if we use that term again, authentic community engagement, what does that look like from CPS's perspective?
Yeah, I think a couple things. Number one, we adopted the Elevate framework, which that was something that Mayor Lightfoot used in her, original campaigning, and we thought it was good. And what the Elevate framework talks about is various levels of engagement, because sometimes when you talk about engagement, it becomes tricky, right? Is it informing people? Is it sitting down and writing policy with, people in the community? Is it, what is community? And I think those kind of questions evaded us for a long time, or to be quite honest, we made it up as we went along. In one situation, community meant this, another situation, community means that. And that's going to happen in a large school system, but I do think it was too arbitrary in the past. So what it means is this, and I can give you more examples than giving a lofty definition. When we talk about the resource allocation piece that I talked about, there are various ways that community members are engaged. And when I'm talking about community members, I want to be clear, there are different layers, and I just want to be transparent how I think about it. The most important constituency are the parents of the students in the school building. That's number one. So you have organized community groups who are organized to keep CPS honest, to keep the mayor's office honest, and we respect that. That's a part of the process. But as a leader, whether that was as a teacher, a principal, even in my role as CEO, the most important constituency always are the parents that have entrusted us to educate their children, okay? Because that's number one. So if we're talking about budget, parents have a variety of ways. At the macro level, the budget working group that I talked about, all those meetings were public. So of course we publicize those, people come. Now the dirtiest secret or trick, if you will, is that we know everybody's not going to come to those meetings. That's just natural. People aren't signing up their Saturdays to go sit and listen to CPS officials talk for 3 hours about budget. But it's open to the public. Anybody can participate in that. And we typically share that information through our social media sites, our website, and directly with our parents through our constant contact system. The second way is that parents are directly involved with approving the school budget for their local school. That is a very defined process. Is done through the local school council, but principals talk about their budget. They make available their budget. Parents can come in and weigh in on that. So there are various mechanisms for that. For the policies that I talked about earlier, one of the things that this board instituted that I thought was really good is that we can no longer change a policy without a 2-month public opinion, a public participation process. And so in the past, we could introduce a policy, we would come in, here are the changes. Oh, this is what principal said about it, teacher said about it, et cetera. And the board would take our word for it and move on. Now we post those policy changes on the Board of Education's website. So if anybody's on here listening, they can go and take a look and see what policies are coming up in the next couple of months. And then people submit public comment. And that has really been a good process. And so there are a variety of ways for people to get involved. But the last thing I'll say about that is that people pick the leaders, whether that's selecting the mayor of the city, selecting the principal, the voting for the LSCs, select leaders to make decisions on their behalf as well. So I am a big proponent that it is part of my job. I think the biggest part of my job is to make decisions. And I take that seriously. I don't think in most jobs you make decisions that impact a person's life the way that I have to in this role. So it's something that I take seriously, but I think getting out and talking to people, engaging them, and doing, what you think is right is the right way to do this. But it's a hard job and you don't always get it right. And if you don't get it right, your responsibility is to acknowledge that and own that and move forward, and try to make the best decisions.
You mentioned that I guess it's not so recent, but a couple of years ago is when you brought on the chief equity officer, the role. What, you spoke a little bit about some of the work that he's doing, but I'm interested in what even precipitated that. Like, what made you decide that for the first time CPS needed a person solely devoted to issues of equity?
Yeah, well, one, there are other districts that did this before us. And I also feel like CPS Chicago, we're in a position where you can do that. I have colleagues in certain states, red states, where you can't even say equity. You know what I mean? So we for all of our challenges and struggles here in Chicago, it's a very liberal space. And the fact that you can even create an equity office and give them a budget with resources and direct line to the CEO is a lot. And so why not take advantage of that? I think the other piece is like, we needed a place to make sense of all the things that are happening. I think that, the analogy or the way I think about this is with all the work that we're doing, and I can sit here for 3 hours and talk about all the stuff we're doing to advance equity. It still feels like I'm trying to empty out Lake Michigan one glass at a time. It's a lot of work. Racism is like air. It's everywhere. Okay. And so to think that one person, one initiative, one framework is going to eradicate that is crazy. But I do believe that the more people we have working to do that momentum and that collective action will make this country different, will make this school system district different. And so that's what motivates me. So obviously seeing those trends, but when I put the equity office together, I did think about ways in which to elevate it beyond what I had seen. Number one, I thought the equity officer needed to report directly to the CEO. There are a lot of districts that have equity officers. They're very symbolic. They don't have real legitimate authority and power in the organization. And I didn't want to do that. So that was important. So he is a member of our cabinet. He reports directly to me and he's involved in a lot of initiatives. The second thing is to give him authority, him or her, in this case, it's a man, authority to make decisions. And so one example is through our capital plan. The capital plan is managed by our chief operating officer. The capital plan is not approved by me and sent to the board until my equity officer signs off on it. So the first year he was in his role, he was in meetings, asking questions, why this project, not that project, what percentage of African-American or Latinx students are, a part of this plan. By the second year, because he had learned from that process and wanted to do more, he had created a whole process and filter, that he worked with the chief operating officer and the other subject matter experts in that area to create a plan that was even more equitable than the plan that we had approved the prior year. So that's just one example, but he's involved in budget conversations. He's involved in a variety of things. And so I think that establishing a place and space for DEI work is incredibly important, but how it is situated and organized in an organization says even more about the organization's seriousness around that and those initiatives.
Yep, I would completely agree with that. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask a question that's not necessarily related to equity, but it's more about your own personal journey to this work. You know, I mean, this is really hard work that you do, and I have a
Thank you.
profound appreciation for it and the work that you do, and your vision, and how you are trying to live out this vision every single day.
Yeah.
What keeps you motivated? Like, how do you, like, you just, in the analogy that you just gave, you created a great visual with your cup emptying out one scoop at a time of Lake Michigan. That's a great visual, but I can imagine that that's exactly what it feels like. So how do you personally know that it's working? Like all of the work that you're.
I think it's two things, working and motivation, two different things. So working, one thing that I'm, really a big proponent of is like measuring what we do. I know not everybody likes that, which is something I don't agree with. I do believe that you have to measure things. I do believe in test scores. I do believe in assessment and those things because, I think if you don't measure it, how can you say something is successful? Also, just to tag on to this, the reason I reject notions around assessment in schooling is because we only talk about not assessing when we're talking about Black kids. Let's just be honest. And that's not the real world. If you can convince me that somebody with my background and my pedigree has a shot at any place without demonstrating proficiency, then sign me up for it. We live in America. That's not the truth. So as long as that's the case, we have to educate kids and make sure they can compete. I'm a big proponent of that. With that said, that's the motivation. The work is hard, like you said, but I think you need people who care. And I think you need people who are competent. And I think you need people who are courageous to do this work. And sometimes we don't have all of that. Sometimes you have people who care a lot, but don't have the courage to make tough decisions and lead. And, I always used to joke when I was a principal and tell them there's a such thing as loving people to death, giving just love, and not expectations and support and helping people to be successful. That doesn't work because eventually when they're 18, they're going to graduate and meet this world, and this world is cold, and we have to make sure they're prepared and can compete. I think the other piece is you have to care. And I've seen a lot of people in key leadership roles, throughout the city, school, who I don't believe cared about the work and cared about public education as much as they should. I'm a big proponent of public education because of my own experience, obviously, but also just as a student of history, I understand how important it is. And I still can't be convinced of any other way to just break cycles of generational poverty without education. The NBA and all those things happen, but for a very select few. And so that's what keeps me motivated. I do think COVID-19 has been a huge challenge. I personally am the type of person that can roll with the punches and can kind of take on anything. But COVID has been something else. And I said this a little bit earlier, but I think the biggest piece is like when all the chips are down and we start taking score and tallying like what matters, in some cases it's been disconcerting to see where Black people, just being honest, still measure up. You know what I mean? And so that's a challenge for me. But it's also one of the things that motivates me to like get up again, get started. We got to work on this. We got to chip away. That's how I think about it. But if you look at the vision that we laid out, I think we publicly declared what matters. And I think that allows the public to hold us accountable to say, hey, you said you were going to meet this goal. Did you meet it? Yes. Congratulations. If not, why? And how are you going to regroup? I think that's important.
So I am going to switch a little bit. I did mention that we had a lot of questions that the community, the participants sent in, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to try and get to a few. And some of them were along similar themes. So there was one theme in particular about what can we do, right? questions, there were people who sent in questions who said, I'm a non-CPS employee, CPS parent, but how can I be a part of making sure equity and inclusivity stays a major priority? What role can I play?
Yeah.
What role can local technology companies play in CPS efforts being more inclusive?
Yeah, I'll take that two parts. Number one, the average person who doesn't have a stake in the district, whether that's, having a child or working for CPS, I think there are a variety of things people can do. Number one, coming to events like this and staying interested and aware of what's happening in the school system is critically important, and also acting on that. There is a lot of misinformation about public schools, whether it's CPS or any school system. And at the heart of much of that is racism, no matter how you cut it, no matter where they direct it to or what it comes back to. It legitimately comes back to a place where people don't believe poor people and minority people do things of value. That's what it comes down to. And so rejecting that and having conversations and really understanding that, I joke with my team all the time, there isn't a pinky in the brain conspiracy. Like, people don't show up to ruin the lives of kids every single day. There are exceptionally smart, talented, and caring people working in our schools, working in our classrooms, working in central office, working in the CEO suite, trying to do this work on behalf of children. And the best thing we can do as a public collective is to support the people who have the courage to do this work and have dedicated their lives to educating students and lifting up public education. I think another thing is working, if you have started with family members and people that you're close to, even with remote learning, one of the things that I've been saying throughout this pandemic is, like, are people reaching out? Do people have family members, church members, or other organizations that you're affiliated with where you are dedicating your talent, your time, your resources to help students? The visuals that we see on TV and the internet around what remote learning looks like is not the reality for majority of the kids in CPS. Majority of our kids don't have these beautifully crafted workspaces at home where they're working and engaging. They are living in situations that make it hard. And the fact that they show up really says a lot about them and their perseverance and their grit. And so how can we best support them? I think the biggest thing that the public can do is to support equitable funding for public education. I have to be honest with you, I was completely dismayed when the fair tax legislation did not pass. I don't understand how so many people voted against their own interests, as well as the interests of the least amongst us. And so there is going to be a reckoning for that. People don't realize that that will result in less funding for the same school system that people pretend to care about. And so again, going back to the equity piece, there are ways to be a part of this and to help, whether it's directly or indirectly through the votes that we cast. But the fact that, we gave people who make a certain amount of money a pass when majority of the people who voted for that don't make that kind of money and probably won't ever make that in a lifetime, I can't even understand it. And the fact is, the kids in CPS and other low-income districts throughout this state are going to be severely impacted as a result of that.
There were several questions, Dr. Jackson, about what is your plan to increase diversity among teachers?
Yep. Well, actually, that's actually one that we're really excited about. I know that the chat, the vision was dropped in the chat. I would also direct people to our Teach Chicago website. We have an amazing talent officer, Matt Lyons, who's doing some great work. But we are trying to tackle this issue, which is a really hard issue to attack, through multiple ways. Number one is there's a total pipeline issue. So CPS actually has more diversity than other districts because we are a large district in a city that people want to live in. The issues are actually far worse in areas that may be, less desirable is not the right word, but you know what I mean. It's easier to attract young people to the city, et cetera. But what we are trying to do is, number one, grow our own. And so creating teacher prep programs in our high schools, like we have at Lindblom. There are several throughout the city. And so we've made an effort to expand those programs at the high school level. And I think it starts there. I think about my own experience when I decided, initially I wanted to be a college professor, but I, declared in high school I was going to go into teaching. And people dissuaded me from that. Like, you could do anything. Why are you doing that? Like, you need to look at finance. You need to look at being an attorney. And really, we need to foster that love for teaching early on. And we need to make sure that our best and brightest see that as a viable career and not consolation prize, et cetera. So we're going to get back to our roots on that. The other piece is we partner with Illinois State University, which happens to be one of the biggest providers of teachers in the state. And we have a pipeline program that we announced a couple of months ago that we're really excited about, where CPS graduates get to go to ISU and that they get, tuition credit and grants and once they complete the program, guaranteed employment in CPS. And so we think we're going to produce hundreds of teachers through that. And then the other program, which was again one of the first initiatives that I enacted, was our residency program. And essentially what we did here is we took employees, many of whom were teachers assistants or classroom assistants in our special ed programs in CPS that had degrees, and said to them, do you want to teach? Pay for them to go back to get their teaching certificate. And the key here, which many of the people on the call who are educators know, usually when you student teach, you can't work. So for these people, they're already working. So the idea of quitting your job to student teach for a half a year is just something they can't do. So we pay them so they can continue earning their salary, but they're learning and completing their coursework, and they can come back to teach. The first year we did this program, we had about 70 people. This past year, we had about 300 people in the program. So we feel really good about some of our pipeline programs. And we think that that's going to help us meet our goal of hiring 3,000 African-American and Latinx teachers by 2024.
Okay. That's right around the corner.
Yes, we're working on it. We hit our goals for this year. Going back to that measurement piece, we have goals for each year. We hit our goals for this year, which was exciting. Yeah.
We had a question that's a little bit different from some of our other questions, but it's interesting and I think it's worthy of mentioning. A question came in about the decrease in overall student population among Black students. What can we do about this? Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, I'm not going to give a long speech on this one, but a couple of things have occurred. Number one, there have been changes in demographics, lower birth rates, people moving out of the city. Immigration slowed dramatically since 2016. And so when we look at the declining enrollment in CPS, it was almost like a perfect storm of a variety of things that happened at one time. I think that the violence that people experience in many communities on the south and the west side of Chicago have been big drivers where I remember when we first started seeing this trend, and it was like anecdotal principals were like, they're leaving, a level 1 or 1+ school on the west side to go to like a western suburb that was safer, but the school wasn't as good as the school that they were leaving. And so that's when we started to see that this was bigger than, bigger than the school. It was really around safety and economics, et cetera. I think going back to that question of equity in real life and coming back to the bigger picture, a lot of this has been driven by gentrification. There are targeted efforts to, change the demographics of Chicago. And that is obviously going to play out in the school system. It is expensive to live in Chicago. Taxes are continuing to rise. So if you have, higher expenses and needs to live in a city and lower income or opportunities in order to meet that, you're going to see these things change. And so Chicago's no different than other cities that have experienced this level of gentrification and these changes. And so that's what we're seeing that's playing out. So I think people should, look into it, pay attention to it. But again, this is also a place where, sometimes we contribute to that. We do. All of us play a role in that. And it's just something to think about. Housing, all of these things are connected.
So we have, yes, and I agree. And there's been this age-old tension between what should education policy do and what should it not do. Like, can education policy sort of solve
Mhm.
all of the issues that serve as barriers for students to learn, or decrease or increase in population? Like, what role does educational policy play in all of that? I think it's $1 million question. We have several questions also that have popped up in the chat that
Yeah.
we'll look at. Some people just thanking you.
Yeah.
I don't know how often you get to thank you and
Yeah.
how much you know, the community appreciates you. So there are a lot of those.
You
There's
want me to look at some of them? I'm happy to take on. I'm looking at them.
okay, yep.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the first question from Marco Mendez, that if people can't see it, it's in the Q&A question. There's a question around the why we made the announcement around school opening and compared us to New York City. And I think that's something I love to talk about. I've been doing a lot of conversation around that. I think the first thing I'll say to this group is that anyone who knows me knows that I wanted kids back in school and on September 8th. So that's just the truth of the matter. I think that, you know, early on, Chalkbeat published an article that showed that 75% of white students throughout the country were receiving some access to in-person learning. And that number was a little over 50% for Black and Latinos. And as a Black person, my entire life, I have never experienced anything where if white people were doing it more than Black people benefited. Never. I can't think of one single example. And so it starts with this notion that schooling and education is critically important. And it was incumbent upon us as a city and a school system to figure out how to do this and do it safely. With that said, we know a lot more about COVID, and we know a lot more about schools and how to do it safely, and whether or not kids are super spreaders and vectors and some of these other things we were concerned about. The other thing that we've learned is that things change with COVID, right? And so what our parents told us early on is that they wanted information. They wanted a comprehensive plan because there were some things left out this summer that are now a part of our plan. And that's why community engagement is critically important, because you always end up with a better plan. And people said they needed more lead time. So when we made our announcement, we can't look at New York. All we can do is look at our space. We gave people 2 months, okay? We don't know what's going to happen in January, but what I do know is that there is no way that I'm not going to try and create a pathway for kids to get back in school. I told people, if they're waiting on me to give up on that, you stop, because I'm never going to wait. I'm never going to give up. I want kids back in school. We have to do it safely. And we've seen good examples of other people that, you know, went before us, and we know what pitfalls to avoid, but we also know that there are more advantages to our kids being in school than to them not being in school. And again, a lot of my decision making always goes back to my experiences. And I know for many of our students, the likelihood of some of these other trappings of poverty are more likely to impact them than COVID. Okay. We can talk about the number of kids that have been killed or shot in Chicago and the number of kids that have died from COVID, and there's no comparison. Our kids need to be in school. And so that's why we made that decision.
Maybe pick one more from this. I think we have time for.
Okay, I see a couple of friends in here, Stephanie and Samantha, so I'll skip those. There was a question, there were a couple of questions, I think Benjamin's question, and also there was also a question about the Chicago Connected program. Our Chicago Connected program was the largest initiative to get access. We have students that have access to the internet. What we did learn is that, you know, because it was free, didn't mean that everybody was going to sign up, because again, our families have relationships with Comcast. You know, some people were like, I'm not calling Comcast. I owe them. Are they going to try to get a bill? You know, so we've worked through that. But I would encourage the person on there, if you know of a single family, or if you hear about this or see it on the internet, if there is a single family, there are two things that I stand on. If people don't have access to internet, if they don't have a device, we will fix that immediately. There are not thousands of kids who don't have internet or devices in CPS. That is just not true. And if they don't, you can email me directly, CEO-Jackson at cps.edu, or you can use our hotline where we're fielding those questions every single day. So that is something that I'm proud of, the work that we've been able to do. The last part, building on that question, was around internet safety and technology. This is a place where I feel like I've become an expert when I didn't know a whole lot about it ahead of time. I think that number one, as a school system, creating, making sure that we have a secure infrastructure and system has been increasingly important. It's a big priority for us and something that we spend a lot of time and dedicate a lot of resource into protecting, but also educating our students on how to be safe online. The fact of the matter is, many of our kids are digital natives and they do this every single day, and they've developed ways of being and habits that, they do when they're on Facebook or playing video games or whatever. But I do think that schools play a really important role in helping them to do that safely. And so a lot of our teachers have talked about, online safety and things like that. And we've had challenges. We have classroom management things that happen online, but I think overall our kids have been very professional and they've really risen to the occasion. And, there've been challenges, but there are challenges when they're in school as well. So it's all part of the work.
So I have just two more things. One is not a question, but rather a challenge, I think, to you. And then the last is a question. The challenge to you, of course, we are the Harris School of Public Policy, and we want to know what role could and should data be playing in helping you see your vision through fruition, right? What additional research is, how can we be a part of the solution and really be a partner in helping you, make this district be the absolute best district in the country?
Yeah. First, thank you. Thank you for that question. I should say University of Chicago in general is an incredibly important partner for CPS, the consortium, Harris, CLA. There's so many programs that connect in a variety of ways. So we definitely appreciate that partnership. What's great about this question, it's almost like I asked you to ask me this, which I did not, is when I think about what we're responding to daily things, but what people don't know is I spend most of my time thinking about life after COVID and, post-pandemic CPS, post-pandemic world, what is that going to look like? And one of the biggest things that I've said time and time again and reflected upon is we have to have a super aggressive approach to researching and understanding what the heck just happened. And if we don't do that, number one, we will be ill-equipped to deal with the impact of COVID, which will be great. We can't even imagine what that is right now. I can go on the record and say that. And so we need to have a robust approach to examining what happened. I think the biggest piece is around learning loss. I don't agree with a remediation approach. I don't think you can remediate what just happened. We have to accelerate. And I would love to, to see research and ideas around how we do that in a way that is both forward thinking, but also takes into consideration the experience that our teachers, our students, our families just had this past year. But to stay optimistic and to keep our foot on the pedal for progress and moving forward, because that's my biggest fear. I don't want to lose all the progress that we've made because of the pandemic. So those would be the two biggest things that I would point out.
Okay, we accept that challenge.
Yes, thank you.
And absolute last question. We have a change in administration coming. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give the Biden-Harris administration? What are your top 3 things that you would recommend to them to advance principles of equity and ensure that all of our kids, regardless of racial, ethnic, and economic background, receive the support and services they need? Top 3.
I think the first thing is funding. I think we need emergency authorization funding right away. We got the CARES money later, whether that's CARES extended or HEROES or some new version with, you know, the new Congress and new administration in place. We need immediate relief, and that's across the board and the economic sphere and other places. But for public education, we need relief. We also need guidance around that. One of the things that I fear is that, you know, rolling out a bunch of money without a lot of guidance is a recipe for disaster as well. And so how do we do this in a way that gets back to the point that I talked about earlier, which is accelerating progress, is critically important. I think the other piece is making sure that across this continuum, whether it's early childhood or college, that we are very intentional about the support that we put in place. I'm a big proponent, and we have to get students in school earlier, which is early childhood programming, universal access, and keep them in school longer. So how do we make the transition as seamless as possible, especially for low income students going from high school to college? We see a lot of people are making decisions about post-secondary, their post-secondary aspirations because of COVID, because of the compounding nature of so many challenges related to this pandemic. And I think the federal government can play a huge role in fixing that. I also think, going back to kind of the last question, is we almost need an assessment of what happened, you know, like, I don't want to say Kerner report or something like that, but we need an assessment of what just occurred, because if we don't, there are people who will co-opt what happens to benefit whatever initiative or mission that they're trying to get across. And we need to be clear about what happened, and we need to have agreed upon strategies for our path forward. But if you were asking me, I think it definitely looks like an investment in early childhood education, a focus on acceleration and recovery from kindergarten through 12th grade, and then a seamless transition to college, which means more resources for those students who are going off to college so that they can be successful.
Well, I have to thank you for this conversation. I have truly enjoyed it, and I hope that everyone who participated on the call has as well. You know, I think it is rare, but it is awesome to see when people are doing the thing that they were meant to do. This is clearly your calling.
Thank you.
And so we appreciate you, and we applaud your work. And I think we are all champions for making sure CPS is the strongest it absolutely can be. And so, based on a lot of questions that people sent in, they want to be a part of the solution. So,
yes.
You know, you are not alone. You do have champions
you.
out here. So I just want to thank you. And I hope you get to have some time off.
I had a little break that last week, but
sort of, you know, re-energized, because yeah, we're all looking forward to what all of this looks like once we are on the other side. So thank you very much for your time, and
thank you,
Dr. Jackson. Have a good night.
All right, bye.
Bye, everyone.